Yeah. I'm welcoming Leny Strobel to a conversation with women in the collective matrix. And Leny is the director of the Center of the Babaylan Studies and professor of American Multicultural Studies at Sonoma State University. She's an author and an editor of books on Kapwa psychology and Babaylan practice, as well as personal narratives on decolonization as a spiritual path. She discusses the process of decolonization of the psyche in order to come home full circle to the largeness of one's own indigenous self. And she says, I use the term indigenous to refer to the self that has found its place, its home in the world. Emptied of projections of inferiority, third world, undeveloped, uncivilized, exotic and primitive, and modernizing. It is the self capable of conjuring one's place and growing roots through the work of imagination, reframing history, and retelling the Filipino story that centers our history of resistance, survival, and regeneration. And we are going to talk about all of this today. And I want to point out that Leny's written quite a few books and edited some. I just finished reading this, a book of her own, Words and Images to Honor the Babaylan. And this is the newest book that she's written, the forward, ethno-autobiography. And I came to Leny's class and talked about my ethno-autobiography a couple of times. And so we will talk, and you are invited to join us in an intimate conversation. How to start? And the first question I had is, what is a colonized person?
Thank you, Molly.
Yes.
Thank you for the welcome. And I'm glad we met each other at the Pioneers Cultivating Women's Leadership. And I think that was 3 years ago?
Yes,
Yeah.
about 3 years ago.
So thank you for this ongoing friendship and conversation.
Thank you.
And I'm pleased to be here.
Mm.
So, what is a colonized person? According to Edward Said, by 1935, almost 85% of all the continents on this planet have been colonized.
Oh my gosh.
So if you think about 85%, what does that leave? You know, when you look at Australia, Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia.
Yeah, we'd want to look at who has
Native
not been.
American. Yes. So a colonized person is someone who has internalized all the projections of the empire or the colonizer onto their concept of self, onto their concept of who they are in the world. So, for example, the reason why my work is focused on decolonization is because specifically the Philippines is the only formal colony of the United States. Yeah. So we were colonized from 1898. We were sold to Spain for, I think, $6 million. I'm not sure of the exact amount now, but for some measly amount, the U.S. bought us from Spain.
Oh my gosh.
Just at the time when the Philippines has already declared independence after the Spanish Revolution against the Spanish. And so the Americans introduced the concept of democracy, introduced public schooling, introduced American English as our language of instruction. And so when you think of all of the material, the discourse, the knowledge produced by the empire in terms of how they saw the people that they colonized. And when the colonized begin to believe in how described as, for example, President McKinley, when he was trying to decide what to do with the Philippines, he said, I couldn't possibly give them back to Spain. That would be wrong. I couldn't possibly leave them alone because they wouldn't know what to do with themselves. We couldn't possibly, abandon. So why not, as part of our manifest destiny, why not give them freedom? Why not give them democracy? Give them education in the name of benevolent assimilation. So that's why a scholar called it white love, because the U.S. also said, we are not going to be the colonizer like the Europeans were. We are going to be gentle. We are going to be benevolent. We're going to be kind.
Patronizing.
Yes. So I grew up under that regime. And when I came to the United States as the culmination of an experience where your desire becomes, I want to be like my colonizer. Yeah.
You consciously?
No,
No,
that's
it's
all unconscious. But it creates a desire, because when the colonizer says you're not good enough, and in order to be good enough, you have to be like me. So that's when the desires and the desire to emulate and the desire to be like the colonizer kind of grows on you unconsciously. This is all unconscious process. So when I began to, when I came here by way of an interracial marriage, and I thought I knew the United States. I thought I was prepared. I thought it would be easy coming here because I spoke English, I knew popular culture, my education was American pattern, all the books we read, you know, I knew Gettysburg Address by third grade.
I didn't never learn that.
So anyway, to make a long story short, when I got here in '83 and people began to respond to me in ways that I didn't expect, I began to wonder what was wrong with me.
So,
See,
example.
I wasn't thinking in terms of what was wrong with the culture. I was thinking in terms of what was wrong with me. You know. So, for example, people would look at me and say, "Did he buy you out of a catalog?"
Oh my goodness gracious!
So, or how come you speak English so well? How come you know all our songs? So you can see, I think in one of my writings I said, we were taught to love the United States. And I thought that when I came here, I could identify with the US, but the US, I realized, could not identify with me. So that was the beginning
I see.
of this becoming aware, becoming conscious of how that colonial projection was internalized.
Yes.
And beginning to have built on the desire to want to undo that.
So, in particular, there's a background as well in your family being Christian.
Yes,
and
Methodist specifically.
Yeah, so your father was a Methodist pastor and your grandfather was a convert.
We were described.
In understanding the influences of the Christian conversion that your family went through and how that tied into further colonization, what is the complication, therefore, with the Christianity as well as the American identification that you have had?
It's very complex. It's very complex, but in one sentence, I sort of summarized it as I was raised Protestant or Methodist by a Catholic mother and a Methodist father in an animist context.
Oh my goodness.
Because the culture is basically animistic and shamanistic at its core, and under just the level of that colonial Catholic imposition and then Protestant, underneath that culture was the indigenous culture, which is animist and shamanistic. And that culture was very powerful, the pre-colonial culture. But because it was repressed and submerged, it took a while for me to uncover that. And so as part of the decolonization process for me, I needed to understand how Christianity became wedded to empire, how it became wedded to capitalism. You know, Christianity, specifically Protestant Christianity, because Catholic is different and Jewish is different, and other strands of Christianity. There's lots of diversity within that, but it's specifically the kind of Christianity I had to unravel was the evangelical kind.
Oh, I see.
The kind that said, if you don't believe in Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior, you're going to hell. You know, so
there's no real redemption unless you get saved.
It was very difficult. Yes.
Yes, yeah. And might it have been difficult as a young woman as well? I know you're one of 5 sisters.
We're actually 6.
6?
An older brother. The oldest is Ernie, who is in Toronto, Vancouver now, and then there's 5 girls.
Oh, 5 girls. Yeah. Do you think in particular it was difficult for a young woman? Because in the disembodied or the division of respect for the body and for the woman's body is frequently what I've run into in Christianity, in the patriarchy.
it, I didn't have to deal with that until recently, maybe just in the last 10 years. Because part of it is because it becomes part of that split, the splitting of your psyche. Then it also has to do with the splitting of your body from your mind, from your spirit. And so one of my good friends who is a poet one day asked me, Leny, how come you never talk about sex in your writing? Or sexuality in your writing? And I had to ask myself that question. What does that mean? Why haven't I? Why wouldn't I write about it? And then I had a series of experiences where there were events that, specifically my father's death, when the question of the body began to emerge for me. And in particular looking at how my father's body, his Methodist body, his Protestant body that was so rigidly disciplined and disconnected from his emotions and from his, and so I began to look at how we grew up, the emotional distancing that happens when you're split. And so as I was trying to redeem my father from patriarchy, from Protestantism, from the disembodiment, I looked back and I would see glimpses of his wholeness. Yeah? Because he loved to raise birds and orchids and tend to the garden.
Right.
And he loved to paint the rocks on the pathway bright red, bright blue. And he loved to sing, even if he couldn't sing. He loved to wear bright colors. And so when he was being himself in that way, being playful and being childlike, and I said, that's my real father. He's whole. Underneath all of that, that was imposed on him, he's whole. So I sort of tried to save him, or what he represented and what he had become under colonization, under the imperial gaze. I sort of was able to then recover that part of him and to be able to tell that story now in this way, to say that my father was whole underneath all of that.
Yes.
And when you see his wholeness, then I could see my wholeness.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So it's connected, yours and his.
It's connected, yes, because a part of that splitting of the body had to do with the severity of the discipline. When you're growing up, we weren't allowed to dance, you weren't allowed to put makeup, you weren't allowed to go to a casino, you weren't allowed to do a lot of things.
No fun, not a lot of fun.
Yes, so the other thing that happened to me was in 2008. I went to the Philippines to a Kapwa conference, and Kapwa means the self in the other. This is an indigenous Filipino core value.
The self in the other.
The self is in the other.
Oh.
So at that conference, this is organized by the Heritage and Arts Academies of the Philippines, and they would invite the indigenous tribal communities in the Philippines. And of course, whenever you have indigenous peoples, they bring their chants, they bring their gongs, they bring their drums, their instruments, and there's plenty of singing and dancing. And when they started doing the community dancing, that's when I took off my shoes and danced in public for the first time.
First time?
Yes. And I said, I'm home.
Oh my goodness. So there was some, yearning and sense of fullness and sense of belonging.
Yeah.
To the dance, to the indigenous.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about indigenous. Then, so what is the definition then of indigenous, and has that changed in your view and in your work?
So this is what happens to me. What happened to me as I was looking at decolonization. What do you do after you decolonize? What do you do after you have unpacked the colonial discourse?
Right.
And I said, where do you go? And I said, where do I go? And I was drawn to the indigenous.
Right.
Because there is a power there that draws you home, that draws you back. And so in the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, I've been looking at what does it mean to be indigenous when you are no longer rooted in your ancestral domain.
Right.
When you are in the diaspora, what does it mean to be indigenous? And for me, the process of indigenization has to do with reconnecting with the land.
Mm.
And when I look a few years ago, consciously, I was standing on the shore of Salmon Creek up north.
Oh, yes, I know
and
it.
I looked across the horizon and I said, over there are my islands, and the only thing that divides us is the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, my body is here, but my heart is there. And my mind is here, but my heart is there. So I said, but it's all one. It's all connected still, right? And I made then a conscious effort to learn how to dwell in Sonoma County, in Santa Rosa.
Ah.
And I told myself, I'm going to learn about this land where I am on now.
Oh my gosh.
I said, I am on the land of the Pomo,
Yes.
and the Miwok, and the Wapo.
Yes.
I'm going to learn how to live here, to dwell here. And the particular word dwelling is really the important part, because as a colonized person, we really weren't taught how to dwell in a place, a given place. To dwell means you get to learn and understand the place, who are its inhabitants, not just the human beings, who are the plants, what is the mountain, how did things come to be, who are.
So a colonized person is separated from that.
Yes.
Because it is shown by the colonizer that that's not good enough, that the land is not to be as important or as significant as an indigenous.
They saw the land as exploitable, as a resource, and whenever you have to extract the resource, you have to displace the people that live there.
Oh.
So that's still ongoing even now.
Yes.
So for us, for my generation, and the Filipinos that came here around the 1930s, a lot of them had to sell their land in order to get an education.
Oh my gosh.
In order to come to the United States. That is still happening.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people have to sell the land. So it's that kind of disconnection that is part of this feeling of being uprooted.
Yes.
And not having a place of belonging.
Yes.
And so part of my work now that I see is, yes, this is where my body is. It's in Sonoma County. But when I look at myself as a human being, I know that the planet is my home. Well, that's sort of kind of too big and too grand, no?
Mm-hmm.
So, but when I think of the Philippines now, the reason why I do the work for the Center for Babaylan Studies is because we are creating a transnational relationship with the indigenous peoples in the Philippines.
Wonderful. Yes.
Because we know that the people that still have the land, that are still on the land, like the Babaylans, like the shamans, are also quite feeling disempowered because, of course, the national government is an instrument of the corporation that wants to extract the resource, develop, modernize, educate the primitive, and so on. So that's still going on, and I think the work is cut out for us in terms of understanding how these things came to be. It's all part of the modern narrative.
Right.
And when I look at the modern narrative that is only 500 years old, and I said, that's too short. So when I started looking beyond 500 years and what went on before that,
yes,
and the hundreds of thousands of years, and you began to ask, how did the Native Americans survive? How did the indigenous people survive this period of holocausts and genocide?
Right. And I wanted to ask you about that because we have some kind of shared history in that my lineage comes from the conquistadors, who were those Spanish people who came over to the Philippines, came to Mexico, and eventually came up to California, and specifically in Sonoma County, where we're talking about the Pomo and the Ohlone lands. They took their land. Well, they enabled the indigenous people to die, and therefore the lands were then empty, because my understanding is about 90% of the indigenous in California died within 20 years of the arrival of the conquistador soldiers. It's an astonishing story. So, it's a curious thing for me to look at this lineage and the connection with the land and what that means, and to have some understanding of the history of the oppression that was enabled by that conquest, by that creation of empire. And So a further understanding of the oppression that was brought forth and perpetrated.
The author of the book, The Racial Contract, says, how can the white people continue to do or continue to perceive themselves as doing moral things when in fact they're being racist?
Right.
And he said it's because they have developed a whole rational and a whole justification for those projects. Yeah? And then as you develop this justification and this rationale, you also develop you begin to develop affective responses. You begin to feel sorry for people on the other side. And so in the guise of doing something for them, of saving them, or or giving them democracy, or giving them freedom.
Classic then with the Philippines, as you explained.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, but what does it really mean? Why were they doing that?
Yeah.
So I think when I know a lot of white folks that are decolonizing now, and the question for them is not so much how they were victimized, but how they were privileged.
Right.
Right, by the system that was created by that period,
right,
by this period that we're in.
Yeah.
So what does it mean to unlearn what privilege is, what white privilege is? What does it mean to understand it, and what does it mean now to develop a connection with the people on the other side?
Right.
And I think this is what I like about your work, Molly, in connecting all the dots in terms of your own ancestral work that you've done.
Try to.
And because it, when we've shown that to my students about how you connected the dots from your birth, your mother's history, to your ancestor who led the Berkeley Massacre, and being able to own that and acknowledge it, and the students said, wow, why did she have to do that?
Yeah.
Because the culture doesn't teach you how to acknowledge and make those connections and to acknowledge that history. But when you do, when that work is done, as I tell my students, there really are gems hidden in those shadows.
That's so deep.
So what is the gem that you discovered as you did that journey of acknowledging that this is part of who you are?
Yes. Yeah. And, and there's so much it seems to understand about the whiteness aspect and the racial aspect, because I grapple with that as a learning, and I more clearly grasp the lineage part. And, one of your students asked me, do you feel guilty? That was like the first question after I finished. It was very profound. And I said, I don't know that's the word. I think collusion. I feel in collusion because I cannot deny that it was a part of me. It is a part of who I am. And it's all of a sudden the realization, who am I? I am this whole lineage of people before me. And then, so I've explored it further, and it's so extraordinarily interesting. Of course, we're related to everyone, and we're made of the earth and the environments in which our ancestors were physically. And maybe this has some connection with the land connection, that we have such a yearning for, from, I think you called it the indigenous soul, or in that, maybe that's really what we're yearning for, is our own connection with the reality of where we've come from and what we are made of. Sometimes I feel possessed by my ancestors, because what am I? I'm everything that has come before, and it's certainly embodied. But it's so important to take a look at the whiteness issue of privilege. And you run into that so much in your teaching and with your students and in your work. So tell us a little bit about your work with the students, and, how do we get to a realization? What is it that we need to do to realize about whiteness, and how does that tie into this shadow and of the psyche?
A few years ago, when I started doing ethno-autobiography in my classes, prior to naming it that, I was teaching, about whiteness and white privilege, but I really did not have a process for helping students move beyond their sense of guilt or shame after they have unpacked all the history.
Right.
And then just dealing with the history takes about 15 weeks. So by the end of the semester, you still leave them feeling like, what do I do now?
Yes.
So when I was talking to Jürgen Kremer, who has done this work on decolonization specifically for the white Euro-American colonial kind of thinking,
Yeah.
I could see that the process that he was able to develop and we experimented doing in my classes now for about 3 years is that when you introduce the indigenous paradigm, wherein you teach the students how to reconnect with their ancestors, with the myths that their ancestors may have brought with them but no longer carry. Um, they have to learn how to reconnect with their dreams, and with mythology, with the stories, and then what does it mean? We talk a lot about what does it mean to connect with nature.
Right.
Because the students say, of course I love nature, but I just don't feel it like love, and then we talk about what does it mean to reconnect with place.
Yes.
Who was here in this university before it was Roanoke Park? Who
Right.
was here before it was Sonoma State University? They don't know, you know. So there are all these different elements that throughout the semester we walk them through. We create ritual, we create activities
Oh, really?
where they could do some research and bring it back and share
Right.
it. And a big part of that is storytelling.
Ah.
They come back to class, bring an artifact that somebody from your ancestor from Europe may have brought with them and present it and share it. Because I think part of the importance of this work is that we're trying to encourage is to develop a participatory sense of place, participatory sense of self. What does it really mean to listen to somebody else's story without judging it, without evaluating it, without negating it, without.
Oh, that's participatory, less judgment.
Yes. And so as we begin to share stories, you have 30 people sharing their stories, and everybody just, wow, your story is so different from mine. And these are all white kids, eh?
Yeah.
So we begin to then say, look how plural whiteness is. Look how diverse whiteness is. How did it become homogenized into just this thing, white?
Right.
What does it mean to go back to all of the stories that we no longer carry and we no longer honor?
Right.
Yeah. And so a lot of them begin to say, wow, I really want to go back and get to know this, get to know my ancestors on this side and on that side, and then it becomes a whole process of discovery. So rather than feeling I'm being made to feel bad in this class because my skin is white,
right,
then instead what we offer then is a way out of whiteness and instead developing this participatory sense of self by including the elements that are normally not included in our modern Western white culture. And you introduce indigenous paradigms, in that.
So, but along those lines, the psyche and the grief around dealing with, I mean, when I first mentioned the Bear Creek Massacre in your class, I wept. I mean, it was a completely involuntary physical reaction. And, the grief of that connection. And so we had talked a little bit about grief, you and I. So how do you deal with the grief, or I guess the dark side, or the psyche, the shadow, when that comes up? It's more being able to talk about story that enables.
I think the sense of grief comes from a sense of loss.
Right.
What did we lose, or what did your ancestors lose as they became Americans?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, because a lot of them brought languages and then they stopped speaking them.
Right.
A lot of them came from particular ethnic groups in Europe. And then they came here and said, you can no longer speak German, you can no longer speak Polish, you can no longer be this, you can no longer be that. But there was a whole period of Americanization. We even standardized English so that we can have American English. Yeah. That is really different from British English and so on. So in the process, students begin to realize the sense of loss from those things. But, they also don't want to keep complaining that, as an American, they have no culture.
Right.
Of course, they do have culture. This is all cultural, right?
Yeah.
We a lot of we honor those emotions as they come up, and a lot of it comes up,
Yes.
and we and because there is a community that receives
Community.
that receives the grief, it's the community that then can hold it together and heal it.
Oh my.
And to encourage them by saying this is an ongoing process. You will continue this process as you get out of this university.
Yeah.
And maybe you're only capable of being able to process up to a certain point, and then but you have a map. You have a map.
Right.
I think I mentioned to you in a conversation earlier how grieving should never be done in isolation.
It's so profound.
Yeah, that we always need to be in community when we grieve.
Yes.
Because what we need is to be a witness to each other.
Yes.
Yeah, to be listened to and
so that's the participatory
acknowledged. Yes.
that you were talking about. Yeah.
It's so beautiful when it happens. Just last semester, a few weeks ago, as we were closing, I gave the students the opportunity to be creative in their final project, and they came up with these beautiful presentations. And this woman who grew up in Humboldt County and finally realizing that the people that were there before her ancestors came were, I think, Miwok. And she began to ask herself, were my ancestors part of how the reason why they disappeared? What happened to them? What did my family have to do with them?
Yes.
So they are beginning to ask those questions, and I think that means that they're ready, to acknowledge, and to do the work, and sometimes it's really, I can appreciate how hard it is to do this work.
Yeah.
Because of course the world outside is so different from what we're trying to create.
And and young people trying to figure out where they fit anyway.
Yeah.
And it's a very harsh and difficult culture. That.
Yeah, I had a student who said if I had taken this class as a freshman, I would not have been a business major.
Oh.
Because my heart has always been in doing something else.
Right.
But I thought in order to make money and in order to get out of here, I need to be business and da-da-da.
Yeah.
And then the values begin to shift, the worldview begin to shift, and they begin to think about maybe I can try something else.
Yeah, it's quite different. Yeah. And we'd one of the things in your book that really struck me was the understanding about the difference in time and the time frame between the indigenous outlook on the world and the Western outlook of in the Western world, we're always trying to progress. We're always trying to get better. We're always trying to get into heaven. So it's an attainment, it's a goal. It's never here, it's always ahead, so that we need to earn it, work for it, go towards it. But within the indigenous, you had mentioned it was the sense of the belonging to the place, to the land, to our Mother Earth. And it seems to be such a profound difference.
Yeah. Well, in the Western sense, time is linear.
Yes.
Yeah, you go from 1 to 10, start to finish, beginning and end. So you're born, you die, you go to heaven.
Right. You hope. Yeah. If you get into the rapture.
Yeah. In indigenous paradigm, time is really cyclical. So that I had a student who was Southeast Asian, I think he's Hmong, and he was beginning to become more Americanized, and so his mother, who is an immigrant, said, I'm worried about you, becoming so American. I wouldn't be so worried about what I wouldn't accomplish in this life, because I can always come back and redo it. I can
Right.
always come back and finish it, you know.
Yeah.
So there's something about the sense of time, you know, that it is so different. But because we're so time oriented in this culture anyway, we're constantly having to negotiate too. You know, that's why I think there's a lot of stereotypical comments about Filipinos always being late, Mexicans always being
Right.
late, you know,
Color people time.
yeah.
Oh
Yeah,
my
color
goodness.
people time.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but
It's
that's all part of it.
it is.
If you go to a powwow, they say that we will begin when we're ready and we will end when we're done. You know, when that would be, you know, who knows? But you have to wait for everything else to be ready. So it is those some of those unseen factors that need to be taken into consideration
Yes.
that that's always taken holistically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll wait until everything and everyone and you know is in place, including the spirits that we are waiting. You know.
And then how is that determined? You know, that's why the Western people get, well, how do you figure out then what is the right time? Because I don't think we would know internally what would be the right time, because we have the outside structure to tell us. You know, you go to work at this time, you eat at this time, you...
Well, to think that the clock wasn't invented until the Industrial Revolution.
Really? I didn't know that.
So people didn't go by 24 hours.
Right.
But, you know.
Well, they went by, you go and you work for 12 to 14 hours, and it begins at 6 a.m. and ends at... Yeah.
I was listening to a lecture on the Pomo and the Miwok and Wapua in Sonoma County, and how the place was really a paradise you know, before the arrival of white folks. And Ben Benson, the lecturer, said people only had to work 2 to 4 hours a day
Oh,
to
really?
produce what they need to eat and live on. You know, and the rest of the time, you know, they visit, they tell stories, they make ritual, they do ceremony, they weave baskets. But that's how much time they needed to gather food, to cook it, and to serve it, the community. You know?
Right.
And how many hours do we work a day to have what we need?
Right. So my question is, how do we, you know, revive or understand our indigenous lineage and heritage when we are so displaced right now? I mean, I can't go back to Ireland. I can visit it, you know, but I'm not going to be in that place. And so what is it that might replace that sense? And some of my thought was, you know, can my body, my embodiment of my ancestry, be possibly my place? You know, my understanding of where I fit. I wonder if that could be as strong.
Because your ancestors are still here. And they still want to be part of you, part of me. They still want to get involved. They want to guide. They want to help.
Oh.
So they're still around. At one of our retreats, and I was meditating on this, and I started crying and grieving because I didn't know the names of my ancestors beyond my great-grandmother.
Right.
And I was crying, but the voice that came to me said, "It's all right. You may not know our names, but we know you. We know you.
Yeah.
Thank you for acknowledging."
I think that's so powerful.
Yeah.
I think it's extraordinarily powerful. That's where I'm kind of exploring at this point is, you know, how do I then, could I listen to my body about when things are right and when to act? Can I, and is that there for also listening to my ancestors who, of course, are me? I'm made up of the ancestors and the land and the places that they came from. So, you know, my sense is that's a powerful story for us, and particularly as women, it seems to me. So I want to ask you a little bit more about women, particularly minority women. What are our challenges as women now in our decolonizing? And, you know, how is it that we can be together in community? I mean, what's some of your thought about the challenges for women now in your context?
For women of color, I think we are still very much dealing with the same issues in so many respects. But in the circles that I find myself, I am finding allies with white women like you, um, like Nina, like other
Right.
women that I have met through her,
Yeah.
And also because I'm married to a white guy.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the work that we've had to do was how can we be together,
Right.
and so
Particularly when you're going through these realizations.
yes,
Mm-hmm.
but like I said, I pay attention to my dreams,
Mm.
and I've had dreams about patriarchy.
Ah.
And but whenever that shows up in the images in my dreams, I know that I'm being reminded that this is the way the patriarch wants to keep me in my place.
Keep you in your place.
Yeah.
Mm.
And I'm so thankful for those dreams because the dreams are, they guide you. They tell you, where is it? And so I know that where I've been influenced by patriarchy, for example, is I have a very strong rational mind,
Ah.
and I'm very controlling, and I'm very judgmental, and I very yeah.
Who would guess this? Leny. We'd never know that.
Yeah. No, but that's the part of what this masculine culture has said women need to develop in order to make a place for themselves.
Yes, I see.
And I think I remember when we were doing that retreat, the Cultivating Women's Leadership,
Yes.
and Nina, okay, we already know, Leny, that your mind is sexy, so show us your body and your emotions. So you see, it comes up in that way. During that week-long retreat, I refused to be emotional. I refused to talk about my body. and so I'm working on it.
Yeah.
I'm unlearning a lot of things because that's very deep. I mean, the kind of conditioning
Yes.
under patriarchy, under modern capitalism is so deep.
Yes.
And we're constantly, every day, trying to become aware of how we are shaped by that.
Right.
Our desires, our wants, and
So we have to examine everything that comes up.
I think that is what waking up means. Waking up is so. It's painful sometimes. It's a lot of work.
Well, I guess you're constantly questioning. You have to. It's ironic because you have to have a rational mind to question it, but then you also have to get to your heart, and your heart intelligence, and possibly your womb intelligence. That we, in particular as women, because we are life givers, there's something, certainly different between the masculine and the feminine, and the wholeness that you've talked about is so.
See, personally, for me, of all of the 5 women, I had to do the most unlearning of the patriarchy because when I was born, I'm the fourth. And my father said, if this turns out to be a boy, that's it. We'll have 4 kids. Well, I turned out to be a girl, and he said, well, God, you're just so disappointing. He was disappointed.
Right.
So he said, okay, we'll try again. So he tried 2 more times. So we're 6. But one time I was meditating on this, and I said, I think all of my life I've been trying to prove to my dad that I am the son he never had. The second son they never had.
Right.
So I was developing all this sort of masculine characteristics.
Yeah.
Unknowingly, unconsciously, because I was trying to please him.
Right.
So.
Right.
Yeah.
And so realizations come as we go through these journeys on where we fit.
But that's part of the decolonization we're doing in my own family is just being able to call those things out.
Really? You can share that with your sisters.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
and then we try to help each other. So somebody will say, yeah, you need to learn how to play. You need to learn how to do exciting things in your life. You're too serious. You're too this. You're too... So yeah, it helps. It helps to have 5 sisters.
those sisters will tell you what to do. This is like daughters.
Yes.
It's true. And
but see, when I looked at that question, Molly, I thought about the history of feminism in this country. And I think in one of my essays in that book, I talked about how I couldn't relate to the history of feminism in this country because this is not where I grew up. Therefore, that history is not mine.
Right.
You know, but when I look at women in my culture and the fact that the culture has always been centered on the mother, you know, and women are basically very strong and have what do they call it? It's a gender balanced culture.
Oh, it is.
Pre-colonial.
Yes.
Gender balance. So.
And the mother was honored and respected in a strong
so
way.
So when I could recover that, you know, then I could fall back on the history of the Babaylan. I could fall back on the history of the women who were leaders of the revolution and resistance. Wow. So I could, yeah.
So that is a privilege, truthfully, that you have, that would seem to me I don't have. Because my history is women being oppressed by the Christian church and the Catholic Church since they began, you know, in Ireland. And it would be harder for me to find the strong woman and mother that is respected. I mean, that's just my reaction at the moment in thinking about that. Is, you know, so in the definition of indigenous, I probably look for something broader than, you know, more philosophical maybe in what that may mean for me, you know, and want to understand. But
you're also a devotee of Mother Mary.
Yes,
I seem to recall.
Yes, very much so. And it's a very liberating devotion and relationship because she is metaphorically, of course, lessened by the patriarchy, by the Christian patriarchy. But she is irrepressible in that constantly the mother figure, the mother, and really what I'm looking at nowadays is mother baby. You know, Mary, Jesus, mother baby, this beautiful life-giving relationship that is the connection that we have through our lineage all the way from the stars. You know, we're made of the stars, but we were born through our mothers. And Mary can represent that for me in a beautiful way. And in so many ways, when people have apparitions of Mary, it seems to me it's them just being able to see the divinity in women, in life, and in Mother Earth, and in the life-giving aspects of what is offered. So for Mary, for me, is an archetype of you know, the connectedness that we have with an unconditional love. Yeah.
You know, 2 weeks ago I was in Hawaii, and our guide brought me to the sacred site of the birthing stone. Have you been there?
Really?
So as we were walking around these stones, I started crying, and the thought that came to me was, thank you for the holiness of mothers.
Oh, wonderful.
Yes, thank you for the holiness of mothers. And the other day, I was at a Catholic festival where there were all this parade of the queens, the different queens, you know, the different images
in
of
Hawaii?
Mary. No, this is in Ukiah. Just the other day,
right.
We have the Filipino Santa Cruzan, and it's a parade of about 20 different images of Mary or representations of Mary.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and there was a raffle, and I won a rosary.
Oh, you did?
And I am not Catholic, so I gave it away. And then later on, a friend of mine said, Leny, what if this was a sign? You know. And I thought about it, and I said, well, my mother was Catholic, and I have never honored her for her faith as a Catholic, because she converted and became Methodist. So I took the rosary back, and I said, I'm taking it back because I want to honor my mother as a Catholic.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So in the process of all of this decolonizing and indigenizing, what I'm really trying to do is to heal the split between Catholic and Protestant, or Christian and non-Christian, or Christian and indigenous, is to try to create a bridge so that when I look at my life and look at all the different parts of my life, including the shadow parts, I could bring them forward into my future and just say, this is my story. The story is made up of these different elements.
It's many different elements.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not to be judged. It's my story. And
it's your story and no one else's story, and no one can change your story. Although you do change your story frequently, and
yes,
we all do in our realizations. Yes.
yeah. But that's what we mean by this paradigm. When you use the indigenous paradigm, it keeps your sense of self so expansive and so inclusive. Inclusive.
Yes.
So, for example, Haynes Makes Noise, this Lakota elder sun dancer who comes to my class, the same class that I visit every semester.
Wonderful.
Every semester he is asked by the students, well, what do you think now about white people? And he says, I welcome them because they came to this place because they knew this place is holy. And he said he doesn't try to negate the efforts of white folks that would like to get to know indigenous ceremonies or would like to attend indigenous ceremonies, because he said, because when they see us doing ceremony, it touches them here. And it touches them here because they knew they used to have that same thing but have now lost it.
Yes.
When they see us doing what we do, they realize that they used to have something they no longer have.
And we want it.
Yeah.
We all want that sense of belonging, that sense of connection and the understanding.
And so the students then feel very grateful that this man whose people, have been massacred, have been enslaved, could be so open and inclusive.
Yes.
And I too wonder about him, but he's this beautiful soul.
It seems so inspiring that, and I think that's where we are attracted as well, is the people who can live in the wholeness.
From that place.
Yes. And, it's a sense of forgiveness. And sometimes the word redemption, we were talking about, well, how do we get saved in some way, which was, the salvific Christian thing, which was, perpetrated on people. But what we want to further understand in a deeper way, not within the format of a religion, but really where and how do we become whole? And how do we act as your Lakota mentor, advisor? Yeah.
I think it's important. So, for example, the student asked him, well, do you believe in Jesus? And he said, as a sand dancer, when I offer myself up every year and dance and do the sun dance, I am offering it up so that my people can continue to live for another year, because we do it every year. And he said, and Jesus did the same thing for his people. So Jesus is my brother.
Oh my goodness. We're all the redeemers.
Yeah.
We can be the redemptive force in our community and in our lives.
Yeah. So it's honoring the stories that we tell. Because after all, we're all made of stories.
Yeah.
And the story that we have told as a culture, modern Western civilization, the story that we have been telling is not working very well, right?
No.
So that's why we're looking for alternative stories, is because we know that this story is not working.
Yes. Yeah, the story is broken. It's a dead end. The dead end that we have in our story now, where we use up the earth, we use up the resources, and we live in this disconnected state. Yeah.
But some people will say, well, it's not a dead end, it's just changing. And whether or not we're ready to change along with it is the question.
Yeah.
Some people will hold on to their sense of privilege, whether it's class, whether it's race, and then they'll try to, create buffer zones
Right.
and keep their privileges within those zones, and it's not going to happen that way.
No.
So
There's no gated community that keeps the air out from your grandchild from breathing the pesticides from the air. There's no gated womb. We have determined at this point that babies are born with already contaminated.
2 weeks ago, when I was at this conference in Hawaii, the World Indigenous Peoples Conference on Education, I went to a presentation on healing the land. And they talk about this particular island that the U.S. military has occupied, where they have exploded bombs there, they have experimented, they have destroyed the water table, so the entire island has been desecrated and destroyed.
Right.
And then when the military left, the people said, "How do we heal this land?"
Yes.
And so they brought in, of course, they had to plant, they had to see how the water can be restored. They brought scientists, they brought anthropologists, but they also called in their spiritual leaders in order, and then begin to do healing rituals and ceremonies and sing the land back to health.
Really?
Again.
Sing it back.
Ceremony.
Oh, it's rich.
Yeah, rituals.
It's rich.
Ceremony, because it is alive, because it's the spirit of the land, the ancestors, and their spirits are still there, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be sang to, waiting to be.
And so that's so rich to think, and I guess some of my understanding is the we are made of the elements, earth, wind, fire, water. Those are our ancestors. It's not just our lineage, but it's also everything around us that is so deeply important, which is, of course, the earth and the elements of the earth. The question, actually, we're talking about healing the earth and how provocative that would be to be a part of that, how powerful. And I get a sense, I want to go there, and be a part of a healing of, I'd like to go to Bear Creek Massacre and be a part of a helpful healing there. Because of my lineage and ancestor and history of my great-great-grandfather perpetrating that massacre specifically. But so I wondered, when we're healing the earth, how does that work actually? And does it work to heal us? Because I'm talking about our bodies, being the place. Our bodies being the location now for our indigenous capability or qualities. I wonder how that all works together.
To me, it's very anthropocentric. It's as if human beings can heal the earth.
Right.
In fact, it's the earth that wants to heal us.
Ooh.
It's the earth that is calling us back and calling our attention.
Oh.
Yeah, but we don't hear very well. And for me, it's very abstract, but when I look at my life and what I'm doing with it and how I'm learning how to dwell in this very small place where I am, and then I can say, to fall in love with that small space and small place where my body is, and do the work as best as I could, would be my healing. Will it heal the earth? Maybe in a small way, but and then I just try to imagine that as, expanding as it includes everything else and everybody else that is trying to do the same thing.
Yes.
And maybe that's where the hope is.
Yeah.
But it's really the earth that is wanting to heal us. And last year when I was in the Philippines and I was visiting my younger sister's house, and in a subdivision where everything has been paved over, but in between the cracks, grass and flowers were growing, and the ancient trees were still fruiting and blooming. And I said, no matter what circumstance, the earth wants to bloom.
It wants to bring forth fruit.
Yeah, no matter how you want to pave over it, somehow it will find a way, But so maybe that was the way of the earth speaking back to me,
Yeah.
trying to talk to me that she will be okay, with or without us.
Yeah. Yeah, and my sense is that, when we talk about ancestry and lineage, that the elements are our ancestors. Of course, the fruit that you're talking about, the earth that's constantly bringing forth, that we then eat, it becomes us. And we are those elements of the earth. So, I think a better understanding of that connection, that we are the elements, those are our ancestors, that is our body, and that's who we are, and that's where we fit in a very large way. Yeah.
And I feel a little bit conflicted about that when we think about GMO and how we feed populations with genetically modified, because that's because the earth has been destroyed enough that it won't feed the population.
Right.
But that's also the corporation's power to tell the story for us.
That's the new version of the empire, it seems to me, or the ongoing version of the empire. And and I'll have to say it's a desecration. In me, it gets a very deep response, thinking that GMO is, a falsifying of the nourishment that Mother Earth actually does offer and give to us, and then we make it into chemicals and may make it into poison. It is, to me, that's close to being called a desecration and a sin, if we want to use those words. Yeah, and because it changes, so then it opens all the things that we need to be thinking about what we are doing to our world, and cloning. Not only are they changing the DNA, then there are clones of the food that we are meant to be eating that are all the same and not produced within the diversity of what Mother Earth brings forth. And what does that do? And then all of a sudden we're sick because our bodies do not recognize what is meant to be nourishment. And that's a very deep and important aspect of a disconnection, in the story. And then all of a sudden, we have to figure out, when do we stand up and say, I do not consent to allowing that in my body. I do not consent to that in my children's bodies, my grandchildren's, to the 20 next generations. I do not consent to this. And I think that women have a particular responsibility for this in a way, because we are the life givers. It is through our bodies that life is brought forth. It's quite extraordinary. And so the beauty of understanding who we are and what we are, and the fascinating histories and stories that we have, just you and I, in our lives, that hold the hope for a clearer understanding of how we're connected and who we are, and we have the same ancestors. We come from the same Mother Earth in a way.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of different elements, but in the end, as we put the pieces or the elements together, the story becomes bigger and bigger until you see yourself as just a speck of dust.
Yeah. Or a little star.
Or a little star.
We could be our own little star. Come from our own star.
But for me, what is sometimes difficult is, say I'm talking to people in the Philippines, and they are developing, they are modernizing, they want to have what we have, because that's what we told them, right?
Right.
You have to develop, you need to buy this stuff, you need it.
Democracy.
And one time someone told me, Leny, how dare you stop us from having what you have?
Yeah.
You see?
Yes.
And so I no longer want to have those kinds of conversations, so that what I'm doing instead is to look at my lifestyle and my own consuming habits and how I spend my money and my resources and the kind of work that I do, so that I can be accountable and responsible.
Right.
In having a smaller footprint.
Yes.
But um, as long as that narrative of development and modernity, modernizing, is the dominant story being circulated around the planet,
yes,
the rest of the world is going to try to be that way.
Yes.
And I said, and I think a lot of folks now are beginning to, a lot of folks in the West here, the countercultural movement is saying, we need to make room. We need to make room. So let's contract our lifestyles.
Right.
Let's contract the economy, because we'll, otherwise we don't have 3 or 4 other planets so that everybody can live a middle class lifestyle like us, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, it's a very difficult question for me.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, I cannot tell my family and my friends in the Philippines that they cannot have what I have.
Right. Right. No.
So,
I understand.
But now they also see, they come to my house, they say, oh, but you don't have this, you don't have this, you don't have this. And I say, yeah, you're right, I don't.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a dilemma. It seems to me that what we're called to do is to hold the qualities of the indigenous that is not the lineal and is more of the spiral, as you're talking about, where we can keep those qualities alive. We can see them in ourselves. We can see it as a wholeness. I think that's what I try to do is, because there are so many things that I do that I'm a part of, my lineage, all of it, I could beat myself up about. If I go to McDonald's, I can tell you 500 things that would be terrible about me walking through the doors of McDonald's, So I try not to do that, but I can't just judge myself all the time, exactly. But in some way, the calling and the work to hold this different paradigm, the different stories, to allow the stories to be brought forth is clearly what you're doing. And it's so essential, is to bring forth young people to have realizations, consciousness, and really what you're creating is the space and the expansiveness to allow that to come forth. So the calling for us, who aren't just teachers, is to enable that openness and that expansiveness as well.
Is to continue creating those containers so that that kind of work can happen.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's our calling. I think that's our best way to welcome the work and the special responsibility that we have as women, I think, as life givers, but to, in our own intuitive heart intelligence, understand where and how we can make this container available in our society, our culture.
Yeah. I see more and more of them. Maybe because I live in Sonoma County and Marin, but
right.
There are more and more people doing the same kind of work, which is encouraging. So thank you, Molly.
Yes, you are so welcome. It is so encouraging and a part, and that women in the collective matrix, we in the womb of the world, by seeing ourselves in this container of beauty and compassion and care, it seems to me, and understanding the energy that we have together, we can support each other. Not only for the grieving that we may need to do, but also for the hope and the encouragement that we want. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Leny. Yes.